When I first came across the story of Katrina Martin, it stopped me in my tracks. Back in 2017, in College Park, Georgia, a team of FBI agents showed up at the wrong house during an early morning operation. They were supposed to be targeting a suspect connected to a gang case, but instead they ended up at Martin's front door. Within minutes, they realized the mistake, apologized, and left. No damage, no arrests, no violence. But imagine that moment, seeing armed federal agents in your home when you've done nothing wrong. For the Martin family, that sense of violation didn't disappear when the agents did. Wanting accountability, Katrina Martin filed a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA, the 1946 law that lets citizens sue the government for negligence by its employees. What she didn't expect was how hard it would be to even get her case heard. The Department of Justice argued that the FBI's actions fell under something called the discretionary function exception, a rule that basically says if a government employee makes a judgment call on the job, even a bad one, the government can't be sued. Both the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia and the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit sided with the government. They ruled that the agent's navigational error was a discretionary decision. To me, that sounded less like justice and more like a loophole, one that made accountability impossible. But in June 2024, the Supreme Court of the United States finally stepped in. In a 7-2 decision written by Justice Clarence Thomas, the court ruled in favor of the Martins and narrowed the scope of government immunity. To me, this wasn't just a win for one family. It was a reminder that even the most powerful institutions still answer to the same laws as the rest of us. Let's start with what actually happened. In July 2017, in College Park, Georgia, a team of FBI agents was sent out to execute an arrest warrant for a suspect tied to a gang investigation. The address they were supposed to hit was clearly listed in their paperwork. But somewhere along the way, things went wrong. A GPS error, a misread direction, no one really knows for sure. What we do know is that the team ended up at the home of Katrina Martin, a completely innocent person with zero connection to the case. According to court records, the agents identified themselves, went inside briefly, realized the mistake, apologized, and left. The whole thing was over in a few minutes. But as anyone can imagine, that kind of mistake doesn't just fade away. You don't forget the day federal agents entered your home by accident. For the Martins, that moment became something bigger, a test of whether the government could admit fault and be held accountable.
So Katrina Martin filed a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, FTCA, which is basically the law that lets you sue the federal government if one of its employees acts negligently while doing their job. When the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, denied her claim, she filed a lawsuit in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia alleging negligence, not misconduct, not abuse of power, just plain negligence. But that's where the real legal fight began, because the government wasn't willing to admit liability. To understand why this case became such a big deal, we have to talk about the Federal Tort Claims Act, or FTCA for short. This law was passed back in 1946, and it was a big shift in how the U.S. government handled accountability. Before the FTCA, there was this idea called sovereign immunity, basically the rule that said you can't sue the government unless it gives you permission. The FTCA changed that. It opened a narrow door, letting people file lawsuits against the government for damages caused by federal employees acting within their official duties. But that door came with locks, exceptions that protect the government in certain situations. Two of those exceptions ended up at the center of the Martin case. First, there's the intentional tort exception, which says you can't sue the government for deliberate wrongs like assault or false arrest. But there's a twist called the law enforcement proviso, which allows you to sue if a federal law enforcement officer commits those acts. Then there's the big one, the discretionary function exception. That's the rule the government leans on most often. It protects federal employees when they make decisions based on judgment or policy, even if the outcome is bad. In the Martin case, the Department of Justice argued that the FBI agent's decision-making fell under this discretionary umbrella. In other words, using GPS and choosing how to approach the target house were judgment calls and therefore immune from lawsuits. Martin's lawyers disagreed, saying this wasn't about policy or discretion, this was a simple, preventable mistake. And here's why that matters. If the courts accepted the government's argument, it would mean nearly any error could be excused as discretionary. That's how this small incident from Georgia turned into a question with national consequences. How far should government immunity really go? Once Katrina Martin filed her claim in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia in 2020, she thought she'd finally get her day in court. Her argument was simple. The FBI made a mistake, and under the Federal Tort Claims Act, the government should be held responsible for it. But the Department of Justice, DOJ, had other plans. They claimed the FBI's actions were covered under the discretionary function exception, meaning the agent's conduct, even the wrong address, was part of their judgment and therefore off-limits for lawsuits.
Judge Eleanor L. Ross agreed with the government and dismissed the case. Her reasoning was that the agents were performing duties that involved judgment and choice, and that kind of discretion, she said, was protected by law. In other words, the Martins couldn't sue because the law itself gave the government immunity. For Katrina Martin, that decision was crushing. The system designed to ensure fairness seemed to have locked her out completely. Not willing to give up, Martin appealed to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit, which issued its ruling in 2021. But again, the result was the same. The appellate judges upheld the lower court's dismissal, repeating that the agent's navigational error was still a discretionary act. Once again, the government walked away untouched. That's when Martin and her lawyers decided to go further, to the highest court in the nation. They filed a petition for review, arguing that this interpretation of the law was too broad, that it effectively gave federal officers immunity for nearly anything they did while on duty. In October 2023, the Supreme Court of the United States agreed to take the case, and that was a huge deal. When the Supreme Court steps in, it usually means something bigger is at stake. This wasn't just about one wrong address anymore. It was about whether government immunity had gone too far. On June 13, 2024, the Supreme Court of the United States released its opinion in Martin v. United States. The vote was 7-2. And for the first time in years, the court took a hard look at the limits of government immunity. The majority opinion, written by Justice Clarence Thomas, tackled the core issue. When can the government claim discretion, and when does that argument cross the line into avoiding responsibility? The 11th Circuit had said that the FBI's actions, including entering the wrong home, were protected under the discretionary function exception. But Justice Thomas didn't buy it. In his opinion, he wrote that nothing in the statute's text supports such a sweeping immunity. In plain language, that means the court rejected the idea that every act involving judgment is untouchable. Thomas explained that policy discretion, decisions about how the government operates at a high level, is different from operational negligence, like typing the wrong address into a GPS. The court made an important distinction. Not all discretion is protected discretion. Operational mistakes, the justices said, don't count as the kind of policy-driven choices Congress meant to shield. That line between planning and execution became the key takeaway from the case. The ruling vacated the 11th Circuit's decision and sent the case back for a proper review. It didn't mean Martin automatically won damages, but it meant her lawsuit could finally move forward. The government would have to defend its actions on the facts, not hide behind immunity. Not everyone agreed. Justice Samuel Alito and Justice Brett Kavanaugh dissented, warning that the decision might open the door to more lawsuits against law enforcement. Meanwhile, Justice Neil Gorsuch and Justice Sonia Sotomayor each wrote concurring opinions, agreeing with the outcome but offering their own takes on how to interpret the law. To me, this decision hit the perfect balance. It didn't strip away the protections that government agencies need to function, but it reminded everyone, from Washington to every small town in America, that accountability doesn't stop at the courthouse door. Or, as Justice Thomas put it, the court's job isn't to expand immunity, but to apply the law as written. When I first read Martin versus the United States decision, what stood out to me wasn't just the legal clarity. It was the principle behind it. This case wasn't about politics or partisanship. It was about accountability. For years, courts had stretched the discretionary function exception under the Federal Tort Claims Act so far that ordinary people rarely stood a chance when they tried to hold the government responsible. The Martin ruling changed that. By drawing a clear line between policy discretion and operational negligence, the Supreme Court reminded federal agencies that immunity has limits. Agents can still make judgment calls. That's part of their job. But those decisions can't be used as a blanket excuse for careless mistakes. The government isn't above the law just because it's the government. And that's what makes this decision so important. If an agency makes a preventable error, like entering the wrong home or mishandling a case, citizens now have a fairer shot at seeking justice. It doesn't guarantee victory, but it guarantees a chance. That's what accountability really means. For law enforcement, it's a wake-up call. This ruling doesn't weaken officers, it strengthens trust in them. Accountability builds legitimacy. When the public sees that even powerful institutions can be held responsible, it restores confidence that the system still works. I think that's what struck me most about this case. The Supreme Court didn't rewrite the law, it just applied it the way Congress intended, with fairness, restraint, and respect for ordinary people. That's not radical. That's how democracy is supposed to function. At the end of the day, Martin versus United States isn't about a wrong address in Georgia. It's about what happens when regular people push back against a system that feels untouchable and win. In June 2024, the Supreme Court reminded every citizen that the law doesn't stop at the doors of power. The 7-2 ruling, written by Justice Clarence Thomas, didn't dismantle the government's protections, it refined them. It drew a line between necessary discretion and reckless negligence. And it said, clearly, that accountability isn't the enemy of authority, it's what gives authority its moral legitimacy. For Katrina Martin, the decision means her case gets a real hearing. For the rest of us, it's proof that the system can still correct itself, that justice isn't out of reach. It's a reminder that even in an era of cynicism, the rule of law can still mean something. To me, that's the power of this story. It's not loud or flashy, but it's deeply American. Because at the heart of our system is a simple truth. No one, not even the government, is above the law.